Earth floated in silence beneath the cold expanse of space, blue oceans swirling with white clouds, continents resting like fragments of forgotten memory. To any passing fleet, it was unremarkable, a developing world, a place still finding its place in the galaxy's hierarchy. And yet, deep below its surface, something was waking. Beneath kilometers of reinforced crust, hidden beneath layers of rock, alloy, and electromagnetic dampening fields, a facility pulsed with restrained power. No satellite could detect it. No scan could penetrate it. No signal could escape it. It did not exist on any galactic registry. And that was intentional. Inside the underground complex, human engineers moved with quiet precision. Their footsteps echoed faintly through steel corridors lined with conduits that glowed with controlled energy. Cooling systems hissed. Magnetic stabilizers hummed at frequencies that vibrated through bone rather than air. Every movement here mattered. Every calculation had been tested, retested, and simulated beyond failure thresholds. In the central chamber stood the machine. Massive, silent, waiting. A railgun. Its structure stretched across the cavern like a monument carved from both ambition and desperation. Coils wrapped around a reinforced firing corridor, layered in composite shielding and superconductive arrays. Power lines as thick as tree trunks fed into it, each one carrying energy equivalent to small continental grids. At its core rested the projectile. Small, dense, unassuming. It did not glow. It did not pulse. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, waiting to be given purpose. A group of senior scientists stood behind a reinforced observation barrier. Their expressions were controlled, but their eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. Some had spent decades on this project. Others had given up conventional careers entirely to see it through. One of them, an older man with streaks of gray in his hair, adjusted his interface console. "System integrity?" he asked. A younger technician responded immediately. "Stable. Magnetic containment, holding within tolerance. Thermal variance within acceptable margins." Another voice chimed in from across the chamber. "Capacitor banks are at 98%. Final charge cycle initiated." No one spoke for a moment after that, because everyone understood what was at stake. If the system failed, it would not simply malfunction. The energy being stored, if improperly discharged, could level entire regions. This was not just a weapon. It was a tightly controlled catastrophe waiting for precision. The older scientist exhaled slowly, then spoke again. "Any anomalies?" Silence. Then, none detected. Another pause followed, not due to hesitation, but due to anticipation. Because for the first time since the project began, everything was working exactly as intended. And that was almost more unsettling than failure. Above them, on the surface of the planet, life continued as normal. Cities glowed faintly in the night. Transportation systems moved. People slept. Children dreamed. Entire populations remained unaware that beneath their feet, humanity had reached a threshold it had never crossed before. A threshold not defined by invention, but by readiness. At the command station deep within the facility, a final status report appeared on the central display. Railgun system, online, fire control, locked, targeting, awaiting input. The room grew quieter, not tense, focused, because everyone knew this moment had been inevitable from the start, not because humanity sought conflict, but because the galaxy would not ignore species forever. And when that attention came, it would not come gently. The older scientist stepped forward, his reflection faintly visible in the reinforced glass. Beyond it, the railgun waited like a coiled force of nature, contained only by human ingenuity and discipline. He placed a hand against the console. "Let's make sure," he said quietly, "that when the galaxy looks at us," he paused, "they understand they were wrong." A final series of confirmations echoed through the chamber. Power level stabilized. Magnetic alignment locked. Firing corridor cleared. All systems nominal. In the depths of the facility, currents surged through superconductive channels. The hum grew deeper. Not louder, but more present, as if the machine itself had begun to breathe. No alarm sounded. No warnings flashed. No errors appeared. Because everything had been built for this moment. And now, humanity stood at the edge of its first true statement to the stars. Not a message sent through diplomacy. Not a plea for recognition. But something far more decisive. A demonstration. A test not just of technology, but of identity. Far above, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the quiet blue horizon, the stars waited, unaware, unprepared, and soon unable to ignore what came next. The railgun was ready, and humanity, for the first time in its history, was no longer just. Long before the stars turned their gaze toward Earth, humanity had already been tested, again and again, by forces that should have ended them. War, resource collapse, environmental instability, technological failures, internal conflict. Each time, the expectation was the same, that humanity would fracture, diminish, and eventually disappear into history as a brief and insignificant experiment. But humanity did something the galaxy had not accounted for. It adapted, not perfectly, not cleanly, but relentlessly. Deep within another wing of the underground complex, far removed from the railgun chamber, rows of simulation terminals flickered to life. Engineers and analysts gathered around holographic displays, reviewing data that had been generated not from success, but from failure. Thousands of failed iterations, each one recorded, each one analyzed, each one learned from. A technician scrolled through a series of stress test results. The projection showed a rail assembly fracturing under magnetic overload. In another simulation, thermal dissipation failed, causing cascading system instability. He zoomed out. The system had failed hundreds of times in controlled environments, and yet it had never failed the same way twice. That was the difference. Humanity did not build systems that simply worked. It built systems that evolved through failure. In a nearby observation room, a senior strategist watched archive footage from earlier stages of the project. Early prototypes, smaller, less refined versions of the railgun, misfired, misaligned, or failed entirely. In one clip, a prototype projectile veered off trajectory and impacted a containment wall. The blast shook the facility. Emergency protocols activated instantly. No one panicked. No one fled. They documented the failure, then rebuilt. A voice from the recording echoed faintly through the room. Adjust coil synchronization by 0.3 milliseconds. No frustration. No hesitation. Just correction. Outside the facility, humanity's presence remained deceptively ordinary. Cities continued their routines. Governments issued statements about technological advancement and energy efficiency. Civilians went about their lives unaware that beneath their feet, a different kind of progress was unfolding. One not broadcast, not advertised, and not shared, because humanity had learned something crucial long before the stars arrived. Not all discoveries should be revealed immediately, especially not to those who might exploit them. Meanwhile, in a secure communication chamber, a classified transmission arrived from an off-world probe. It contained intercepted data fragments, alien chatter, fleet movement patterns, and a classification tag that had been repeated across multiple galactic channels. Primitive species, non-threat assessment confirmed. The room fell silent as analysts reviewed the file. One of them leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. "They've already categorized us," he said quietly. Another responded, just as calmly, "Then we adjust their classification." No anger, no fear, only certainty. Back in the railgun facility, power systems underwent another verification cycle. Capacitors discharged and controlled pulses, recalibrating alignment tolerances. Magnetic fields stabilized with near-perfect synchronization. Every subsystem was monitored, every variable accounted for. because humanity understood something the galaxy often overlooked. A single mistake in the wrong moment could define an entire species, and humanity had no intention of being defined by failure. In a central briefing chamber, leadership gathered one final time before the system will be fully armed for its first operational test. A holographic projection displayed orbital trajectories, projected engagement ranges, and potential outcomes based on various scenarios. The railgun was not just a weapon, it was a statement. But statements, if made too early, could provoke consequences beyond control. A commander stood at the head of the room, arms folded behind his back, eyes fixed on the rotating projection of Earth and its surrounding space. "The fleet will arrive soon," he said. No one needed to ask which fleet. They had all been anticipating this moment for years. The galaxy was not patient, and power, when left unchallenged, always sought expansion. Another analyst spoke up. "Once they confirm our classification, they'll assume orbital superiority." A pause. Then they'll deploy. A heavier silence followed, because everyone understood what that meant. Invasion was not a question of if. It was a question of when. The commander nodded once. "Then we ensure," he said, voice steady and controlled, "that their assumptions are incomplete." At that moment, a subtle alert pulsed across multiple internal systems. Not an alarm, but a notification. Long-range sensors had detected an anomaly, not on Earth. Above it, far above it, a distortion in space-time consistent with faster-than-light emergence. Multiple signatures. Massive, coordinated. The room shifted instantly from stillness to alert focus. Eyes moved to the central display as new data populated in real time. A fleet entering orbit. No panic followed. No shouting. No scrambling. Only confirmation. The moment humanity had prepared for had arrived. A technician quietly locked the final system interface. Another initiated targeting readiness protocols. And in the depths of the facility, the railgun, silent until now, registered its first external engagement parameter, not as a reaction, but as a readiness. Above Earth, the stars began to move unnaturally, not as stars should, but as ships, massive, intentional, and utterly certain of their dominance. Inside the facility, one final message appeared across the central console. External contact detected. Status: hostile presence confirmed. The older scientist who had spoken in part one read the message without surprise. He exhaled slowly, then looked toward the chamber beyond the glass. The railgun remained still, waiting, not for permission, not for validation, but for the moment humanity had been anticipating all along. He spoke softly, almost himself. "So it begins." Above them, the galaxy had arrived, and humanity, quiet, persistent, and unyielding, was no longer being tested in simulations. It was being tested in reality. The first sign was not visible to the human eye. It was felt, a subtle distortion in the upper atmosphere, barely measurable, yet unmistakable to the instruments tracking orbital space. Sensors that had remained dormant for years suddenly spiked as reality itself seemed to ripple. Then, without warning, they arrived, in low Earth orbit. Space fractured into sudden emergence points. One after another, massive vessels materialized from faster-than-light transitions, their hulls reflecting distant starlight in cold, metallic silence. Warships, not probes, not envoys. A fleet, each vessel dwarfed continents. Their silhouettes were layered with weapon arrays, energy conduits, and shield emitters that pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of some vast mechanical organism. At the center of the formation loomed the flagship, its structure more intricate, more imposing, and more heavily armored than the others. It held position with deliberate authority, as though the rest of the fleet orbited not the planet, but its will. Inside the command decks of the alien armada, coordination began instantly. No chaos, no confusion, only precision. Data streamed across holographic interfaces, mapping Earth's gravitational field, atmospheric composition, and electromagnetic signatures. Tactical overlays projected potential landing zones, orbital bombardment vectors, and defensive weak points. A species that had conquered dozens of worlds now prepared to claim another, and in their calculations, Earth presented no challenge. Surface scans complete, one officer reported, their voice filtered through mechanical translation systems. No planetary scale shielding detected. Another voice followed, calm and absolute. No orbital defense grid capable of intercepting sustained bombardment. A pause. Primitive. The word carried no insult, only classification. On the bridge of the flagship, the fleet commander stood elevated above the rest, observing the planet below through a vast panoramic viewport. Earth rotated slowly beneath them, unaware of the judgment now being passed upon it. The commander's form was tall and imposing, adorned in layered regalia that signified rank, conquest, and authority. Behind them, banners bearing imperial insignia drifted subtly within artificial gravity fields. They had seen many worlds like this before, and many worlds had broken before them. Broadcast the ultimatum, the commander ordered. Immediately, a transmission beam descended toward the planet's surface, cutting through the atmosphere with focused precision. On Earth, communication arrays detected the incoming signal and routed it through secure channels. In the underground facility, alerts activated across multiple systems. A single message appeared on the main display. Unknown source, priority transmission received. The message was decoded instantly. It was not complex. It was not subtle. It was absolute. Across every available channel, the voice of the Empire echoed, measured, cold, unquestioning. Surrender your planetary governance. Cease all defensive preparations. Submit to Imperial oversight. Non-compliance will result in immediate and total neutralization. In the command chamber beneath Earth's surface, human leadership listened in silence. No one interrupted the transmission. No one reacted emotionally. They had anticipated this moment. A junior analyst broke the silence first. "They're not negotiating," he said quietly. A strategist nearby responded without looking away from the data feeds. They never intended to. On the surface, satellites relayed the transmission globally. Governments, military installations, and emergency networks all received the same message simultaneously. Around the world, humanity paused, not in fear, but in recognition. This was the moment they had prepared for. Back in orbit, the alien fleet began its next phase. Dropships detached from carrier vessels in synchronized formations, their hulls igniting with control thrust as they angled toward atmospheric entry. Shield emitters activated, forming protective layers designed to withstand friction, heat, and resistance. Their descent was not rushed. It was calculated, controlled, inevitable. Deployment units confirmed. An officer reported. Landing vectors locked. Target zone secured. Within the flagship, the commander observed the operation unfold with measured satisfaction. This world had no visible means of resistance. No defensive satellites capable of interception. No energy grid capable of planetary shielding. No fleet in orbit. No signal of advanced deterrence. To them, Earth was already contained, already classified, already conquered in all but formal designation. "Prepare ground occupation forces," the commander said. "Resistance is statistically negligible." On Earth, deep within the underground facility, the Railgun system registered the presence of multiple incoming objects entering the upper atmosphere. Hundreds, no, thousands, each one tracked in real time, each one descending toward the surface with purpose. The system processed their trajectories without hesitation, not as threats to be feared, but as variables to be engaged. A technician monitored the targeting grid as overlays populated across the central display. Orbital positions, velocity vectors, entry angles. Every invading vessel was now visible, not to the naked eye, but to human precision. One by one, the analyst teams reviewed the data. No panic, no confusion, only confirmation. The fleet had arrived. The invasion had begun. In the railgun chamber, the projectile remained motionless within its firing corridor. Magnetic fields tightened around it, maintaining perfect alignment. Power systems began their final pre-engagement stabilization cycle. The hum deepened. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Above Earth, the alien dropships pierced the atmosphere, their descent marked by streaks of controlled energy cutting across the sky. To any observer, it would have looked like inevitability descending from the heavens. A force that could not be stopped. A conquest that could not be challenged. But deep beneath the surface, humanity was no longer observing. It was calculating, waiting, and preparing to respond. Because for the first time since the Empire had arrived, Earth was not a target without defense. It was a system that had already decided how to answer, and in the silence before the first shot, both sides believed the From orbit, Earth appeared defenseless. That was a conclusion reached within minutes of the Empire's arrival. reaffirmed, verified, and accepted without dissent. No orbital shields, no visible fleet, no defensive grid capable of intercepting high-yield bombardment. To the Empire's commanders, the planet below was not a battlefield. It was a formality. Inside the flagship's command chamber, tactical displays projected Earth in layered holographic detail. Grid lines wrapped the planet's curvature, marking regions of interest, population centers, industrial zones, and likely command structures. Each region was assigned a probability score. Resistance potential, negligible. Surface communications show no coordinated mobilization, an officer reported. Energy output remains consistent with civilian infrastructure. Another officer added, no spike in military-grade emissions. The data reinforced their expectations. No alarms, no escalation, no signs of preparedness. The fleet commander observed silently, standing at the center of the bridge as the reports flowed in. Around them, officers and systems operated in synchronized efficiency, each component of the machine fulfilling its role without hesitation. This was not their first conquest, and in every prior campaign, the pattern had been the same. A species that appeared unprepared would attempt resistance only after realizing its futility. By then, it was always too late. Begin atmosphere deployment, the commander ordered. The command was calm, final, unquestioned. In response, multiple dropships disengaged from their carriers in perfectly timed sequences. Their hulls glowed faintly as they activated entry shields, layered energy fields designed to withstand heat, friction, and particle resistance as they descended through planetary atmospheres. They aligned themselves with predetermined coordinates. No improvisation was required. The invasion had already been mapped. On the flagship's display, Earth rotated slowly beneath the fleet, its continents passing under projected targeting overlays. Landing zones were highlighted in soft pulses of light. Urban regions were identified and marked. Strategic sites were flagged. Infrastructure nodes were indexed. The Empire did not simply invade. It optimized conquest. Ground forces will secure planetary control within projected time frame, and analysts reported. Resistance probability remains below threshold. A second voice followed, almost routine in tone. No anomalies detected. Below, on the planet's surface, humanity continued to receive the transmissions. Governments coordinated responses. Emergency protocols activated. Military units mobilized in ways that had been planned long before this moment. But none of it was rushed. None of it was chaotic. Because deep within classified channels, a single directive had already been issued. Wait, back underground. Within the hidden facility, the Railgun system status indicators shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but precisely. A new layer of data populated the targeting interface. Real-time tracking of incoming vessels as they crossed into the upper atmosphere. Their heat signatures, their velocities, their trajectories, all captured, all processed, all analyzed. A technician leaned forward slightly, watching the descending objects represented as moving points across a three-dimensional grid. They had begun entry, he said. No one responded immediately, because everyone already knew. The older scientist from Part 1 stood at the observation window once more. Beyond the reinforced glass, the railgun chamber remained still, its immense structure now fully synchronized with power systems that had reached operational readiness. The hum in the room had changed. Not louder, not faster, but deeper, more present, as though the machine had completed its final stage of awakening. Target tracking is stable, a systems operator reported. Atmospheric entry vectors confirmed from multiple contacts. Another voice added, we have full orbital lock on all identified units. The strategist from earlier stepped closer to the central display, studying the incoming formation patterns. They're not scattering, he noted. No evasive maneuvers. Another analyst replied, they don't expect resistance. A quiet pause followed, because that observation carried weight. In every prior encounter across the galaxy, the Empire had relied on a consistent truth. Their presence alone was enough. Their reputation preceded them. Their technology, their fleets, their history of conquest, all combined to create an expectation of inevitable dominance. Opposition was rare. Successful opposition was unheard of. And so, they approached Earth with the same assumption, that the planet would react, that it would resist, and that resistance would fail. But what they had not accounted for was silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of preparation. Inside the facility, final system checks completed automatically. Magnetic alignment locked. Thermal stabilization confirmed. Power delivery within optimal range. Firing corridor cleared. On the surface, the sky began to change. Streaks of light appeared as the dropships entered deeper into the atmosphere. Friction heated their hulls, creating brilliant trails that could be seen from multiple regions across the planet. To any observer, it might have resembled a meteor shower. But unlike meteors, these objects were guided, intentional, alive with purpose. In the flagship, the commander watched as the first wave of dropships neared their descent phase. Begin planetary insertion sequence. They ordered, secure landing zones, establish control points. Their confidence remained unchanged, because everything they had observed confirmed their assessment. Earth was unprepared, unshielded, outmatched, but within the underground facility, humanity had reached the exact opposite conclusion. Not that the Empire was invincible, not that the invasion was unstoppable, but that it had already made its first, and perhaps only, critical mistake. It had assumed that Earth's silence meant weakness, and in that assumption, it had revealed itself. Tracked, measured, understood. The Railgun system reached final readiness. The targeting interface stabilized on its first confirmed orbital engagement solution. A single projectile, a single shot, a single decision point. Above Earth, the Empire believed control had already been established. Below it, humanity prepared to demonstrate otherwise, and in the tension between those two beliefs. Inside the underground chamber, silence was no longer passive. It was controlled, measured, intentional. Every system had reached alignment. Every parameter had stabilized. Every variable had been reduced to a state of near-perfect predictability. This was the moment the railgun had been designed for. Not testing, not simulation. Execution. At the center of the vast chamber, the projectile sat encased within the firing corridor, immobile, unassuming, and deceptively simple. No markings identified it as anything special. No external indicators revealed its purpose. And yet, it represented the culmination of years of hidden development, countless iterations, and failures that had been quietly absorbed and overcome. It was not just a projectile. It was humanity's first answer to the galaxy. Around it, electromagnetic coils began their final pre-activation phase. Energy flowed through superconductive channels, guided with precision by layer control systems that synchronized magnetic fields across the length of the barrel. The air itself responded. Subtle vibrations rippled through the chamber walls, not destructive, not unstable, but present, as though the structure itself recognized the magnitude of what was about to occur. In the command station, personnel monitored final readiness indicators. A countdown appeared on the central display. Not automated, not forced, authorized. A senior operator glanced toward the commanding officer. System alignment confirmed, he said. Another voice followed immediately. Target lock established. A third added. Orbital trajectories stabilized for engagement solution. No one rushed. No one spoke over one another, because each person understood their role had already been completed. What remained was not preparation. It was permission. The commander stepped forward, standing before the central interface. Beyond the reinforced glass, the railgun chamber stretched into the distance like a dormant titan awaiting activation. He studied the data one final time. Orbital positions of the incoming fleet, descent vectors of the dropships, velocity calculations, impact windows, everything aligned. On the display, a single contact point was highlighted. A large vessel in low orbit, one of the fleet's primary capital ships, protected by layered shielding, supported by advanced defense systems, and yet entirely within engagement range. The commander's voice was steady. Target confirmed. A pause. Then, authorized firing sequence. The order propagated instantly through the system, not as a command, but as activation. Deep within the railgun structure, power reserves surged. Capacitor banks discharged in a controlled cascade, channeling immense electrical energy into magnetic coils lining the firing corridor. The coils responded immediately. Magnetic fields began to intensify, coalescing, tightening, focusing. The projectile, previously held in perfect equilibrium, now felt the influence of accelerating forces building around it. In the chamber, technicians watched their displays closely. Field strength rising, thermal output within tolerance, structural integrity holding. No anomalies detected. Outside the facility, on the surface of the planet, nothing appeared changed. The sky remained clear except for the distant streaks of descending dropships. Cities continued their quiet observation of the unfolding invasion, but deep beneath the ground, something had begun. Inside the firing corridor, magnetic compression reached critical thresholds. Field lines aligned, energy channels stabilized. The system entered its final synchronization phase. Every microsecond was accounted for, every variable locked into place. A technician's voice cut through the silence. Charge complete. Another followed immediately. Firing corridor sealed. A third. Projectile containment disengaging. The final stage had begun. On the flagship above, sensors continued to monitor planetary conditions. No unusual emissions. No defensive signatures. No sudden spikes in activity. Everything appeared unchanged. But change does not always announce itself. In the railgun chamber, the last restraints disengaged. The projectile was no longer held in passive equilibrium. It was now subject to the full force of the system's electromagnetic acceleration profile. The commander spoke one final time. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with certainty. Fire. The moment the command was given, the system responded instantly. Electrical energy surged forward in a precisely timed sequence. Magnetic fields collapsed and reformed in rapid progression, each stage accelerating the projectile further along the firing corridor. The air inside the chamber compressed briefly under the force of shifting fields. And then, release. The projectile was no longer stationary. It was no longer contained. It was no longer waiting. In less than a fraction of a second, it transitioned from stillness to motion at velocities beyond conventional comprehension. The railgun did not produce a visible explosion. No external flash illuminated the chamber. No shockwave radiated outward in dramatic fashion. Instead, the system converted stored energy into directed kinetic force with surgical precision. Inside the chamber, monitors registered the event in data streams rather than visuals. Velocity spike confirmed. Trajectory locked. Exit achieved. In orbit, completely unaware of the exact moment it happened, the Imperial fleet continued its descent operations. Dropships entered deeper atmospheric layers. Command systems maintained their assumptions. The fleet remained confident, but something had just changed, not visibly, not audibly, but fundamentally. A single object, launched from deep beneath the surface of Earth, was now moving upward toward orbit at speeds that defied the expectations of those who had never considered that a primitive world could respond in such a way. In the railgun chamber, the system stabilized immediately after discharge. No overheating, no structural damage, no instability, only confirmation. First shot, successful. In the silence that followed, humanity had crossed a threshold, not of technology alone, but of decoration. Because in that single moment, Earth had stopped being a passive world under observation. In the void above Earth, the Empire's formation continued its descent with practiced precision. Dropships angled through atmospheric layers, their shielding systems glowing faintly as they cut through friction and heat. Within each vessel, alien troops stood ready, secured in launch restraints, their attention focused on final descent protocols and landing synchronization. To them, this was routine, controlled, inevitable. On the flagship, command systems displayed layered projections of invasion in progress. Entry vectors aligned. Landing zones remained uncontested. No defensive intercepts had been detected. No countermeasures had been deployed. Everything matched expectation. Atmospheric insertion proceeding within optimal parameters. An officer reported. Landing sequence ETA unchanged. Another voice added, no anomalies detected in planetary response. The commander observed the data silently. The world below remained quiet. Too quiet, but not in a way that suggested danger. In a way that suggested absence. Maintain formation integrity, the commander ordered. Proceed with standard occupation protocol. Across the fleet, operations continued without interruption. And yet, unknown to them, something had already crossed the threshold between preparation and action. Far beneath the surface, the railgun had completed its firing sequence. The projectile, now no longer constrained by containment or acceleration, had exited the firing corridor and transitioned into free flight. Its velocity was not merely high. It was extreme beyond conventional measure. At the moment of launch, sensors within the facility had registered the projectile's acceleration profile, but those readings were internal. Outside observers, especially those not anticipating such a phenomenon, would have no frame of reference for what had just been released. In orbit, Imperial detection systems began their routine scans. They monitored electromagnetic emissions, thermal signatures, radiation fluctuations, gravitational disturbances. But these systems were optimized for energy-based weapons, known propulsion signatures, and conventional attack vectors. They were not designed to anticipate a silent, non-emissive object traveling at relativistic speeds without warning. Within the flagship, a minor fluctuation appeared on a peripheral sensor array. A single spike, transient, minimal. An officer glanced at it. Sensor noise, they stated. The anomaly was dismissed without escalation. No further investigation was initiated. At that exact moment, the projectile crossed a critical threshold. It entered near-orbital space. Its trajectory, calculated and refined before launch, aligned precisely with one of the Empire's capital vessels, an enormous dreadnought positioned among the formation of the fleet. The ship's hull was reinforced with layered alloys. Its outermost defenses included advanced shielding systems designed to disperse energy impacts, deflect plasma-based weapons, and absorb sustained bombardment. Under normal combat conditions, it was nearly impervious to conventional attack. But this was not a conventional attack. The projectile approached at a velocity that compressed reaction time into irrelevance. To the sensors aboard the dreadnought, the object appeared not as a tracked target approaching over time, but as a sudden, unavoidable intrusion into detection range. Alarms triggered, not across the entire fleet, only locally, on the dreadnought itself. Unknown contact detected. Impact trajectory locked. Adjust shield orientation. Commands were issued rapidly, but the system's response lagged behind the incoming threat. Because the window for reaction was already closing, the ship's shielding systems activated, forming layered energy barriers along the projected path of impact. Generators surged. Field aligned. Defensive protocols engaged. But the projectile did not slow in a way the shields could meaningfully interpret. It did not disperse. It did not reflect. It did not lose coherence. It struck. The moment of contact occurred without visual warning at first. Then, a disruption, a point of intense distortion where projectile met the ship's defensive layers. The shielding attempted to absorb and redistribute the force. But the nature of the impact exceeded the design parameters of the defense system. The outer hull of the dreadnought registered a sudden internal stress cascade. Energy sensors spiked. Structural integrity warnings activated across multiple internal subsystems. For a fraction of a second, the ship appeared to resist. Then resistance failed. The projectile penetrated through the outer shielding layers, continuing its path with minimal deviation. It did not explode on contact. It did not fragment. It did not disperse its energy outward in the way the Empire's systems were built to counter. Instead, it transferred its kinetic energy along a direct path to the vessel's internal structure. Within the dreadnought, alarms escalated instantly. Entire sections of the ship registered catastrophic breaches. Internal systems began to fail in rapid succession. Power grids fluctuated. Structural nodes collapsed. Containment fields destabilized. And then, at the core of the vessel, a critical threshold was reached. The dreadnought central systems, designed to withstand extreme conditions, encountered a force they could not redistribute. Energy readings spiked beyond measurable limits. For an instant, the ship glowed from within, not externally, internally, as if the very structure of the vessel was overwhelmed from the inside out. Then the readings dropped. Abruptly, on the flagship, command systems registered the loss. A capital vessel, gone, not disabled, not damaged, destroyed. No debris field of expected scale. No prolonged distress signals. No gradual failure. Just absence. An officer's voice broke the silence. Capital vessel, contact loss. Another followed. Urgency entering their tone for the first time. Confirm status. A pause. Then the answer came. Confirm destroyed. Across the bridge, the atmosphere shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. For the first time since their arrival, the Empire's confidence encountered something it had not anticipated. Not resistance in the traditional sense. Not a prolonged engagement. But a single, decisive event that bypassed everything they relied upon. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of Earth, humanity's system recorded its first successful orbital strike. Not as a miracle, not as luck, but as execution. The galaxy had just witnessed something it did not yet understand. A primitive world had fired once, and in that the destruction of the dreadnought did not register across the Empire as a simple loss. It registered as an impossibility. On the flagship, silence spread faster than any alarm could, not the silence of inactivity, but the silence that follows something no one has a framework to explain. Holographic displays continue to update, data streams flowing uninterrupted. But now, those streams carried something new: confusion. "Reconfirm vessel status," the commander ordered, his voice steady, but no longer indifferent. An officer immediately initiated a full systems query across fleet networks. Cross-referencing with remaining assets, no contact reestablished. A pause. "Capital vessel has not responded to repeated transmission attempts." Another officer leaned forward, reviewing residual telemetry fragments. Last known readings indicate structural failure originating from internal vectors. The words hung in the air. Internal vectors. Not external bombardment. Not sustained attack. Not coordinated strike. "Explain," the commander said. No emotion, but the expectation behind the word was unmistakable. The analysts worked quickly, pulling every available fragment of data from a moment of impact. Sensor logs, shield fluctuations, energy spikes, structural stress markers. Layer by layer, they reconstructed the final milliseconds of the dreadnought's existence. A projection appeared on the central display. It showed the incoming object, not as a continuous trajectory, but as a sudden event captured within detection range. No prolonged tracking, no gradual approach, just appearance, impact, collapse. An officer spoke cautiously. Whatever struck the vessel, it was not detected until it was already within engagement proximity. Another added, shield response time was insufficient. A third, reviewing comparative models, hesitated before speaking. It did not behave like a conventional projectile. That statement drew attention. "Clarify," the commander said. The analyst adjusted the display. "Energy-based weapon produced signatures. Thermal, electromagnetic, plasma dispersion. These are predictable and interact with shielding layers in known patterns." He paused. "This did not match those patterns." Another officer interjected, more sharply now. "Then what did it match?" Silence followed, because the answer was not immediately available in their classification systems. After several moments, the analyst responded. "It behaved as a high-velocity kinetic impact." A pause. "But with no detectable propulsion signature, no emission profile, and no pre-impact energy buildup within our sensor's resolution thresholds." The commander processed this in silence, then asked a question that shifted the tone of the entire bridge. Could it be repeated? No one answered immediately, not because they lacked information, but because the implications were still being understood. Across the fleet, secondary sensor arrays began recalibrating, scanning Earth with heightened sensitivity. This time, not with assumptions, but with caution. Within the orbital formation, subtle adjustments began. Ships shifted their orientations. Shield systems were reinforced. Targeting systems widened their parameters. Dropships already in descent maintained their trajectories, but internal alert levels increased. "Update fleet status," the commander ordered. Reports came in rapidly. No additional impact detected. No further losses. No visible offensive activity from the planet's surface. And yet, one capital vessel had been eliminated without warning. In the absence of a second strike, the situation became more complex, not less, because now the Empire faced something it had not encountered in recorded history. A single, successful attack that defied classification. On the flagship, the commander turned toward the viewport. Below them, Earth remained unchanged, blue, silent, calm. But now, that calm carried a different meaning. "Planetary assessment," the commander said. A pause. Then, more deliberately, reevaluate classification. The analysts immediately began updating internal threat models. Previously assigned parameters, primitive technology, low defensive capability, negligible offensive potential, were no longer sufficient. They had been proven incomplete. An officer spoke carefully, choosing words that reflected the shift in understanding. "Unknown weapons capability confirmed." Another added, "Delivery method remains undetected." A third concluded, "Response capacity exceeds prior estimates." The phrase lingered. Exceeds prior estimates. Not equals, not slightly above, but beyond what had been anticipated. The commander remained motionless, observing the data as it updated in real time. For the first time since entering orbit, the situation was no longer predictable. A species they had classified as primitive had demonstrated the ability to destroy one of their most heavily fortified assets, not through overwhelming numbers, not through advanced fleets, but through a single precise action, and that introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty was something the Empire was not accustomed to managing in conquest scenarios, because their dominance had always been built on predictability. Their enemies reacted, they adapted, they resisted, and then they fell. But Earth had not reacted in any visible way prior to the strike. It had remained silent, observing, waiting. Now, that silence no longer represented absence. It represented concealment, a just operational posture. The commander finally said. The order was subtle, but significant. This was no longer a routine occupation. It had become an engagement requiring reassessment. Across the fleet, internal doctrines began to shift. Not retreat, not escalation, but recalibration. Dropships continued to descend toward the surface, unaware of the full scope of what had just occurred above them. But command structures now operated under revised assumptions. The planet below could not be treated as defenseless. On Earth, deep beneath the surface, human systems continued tracking orbital activity. The Railgun's targeting interface remained active. Data flowed in continuously. Incoming vessels, updated positions, behavioral changes in the fleet. And now, the first confirmed result of engagement had been recorded. Humanity had not just fired a weapon. It had proven a concept. In orbit, the Empire now faced reality it could not ignore. A world they had dismissed had demonstrated an offensive capability that bypassed their defensive doctrines entirely. And for the first time since their arrival, the Empire began to feel something unfamiliar. Not the fleet did not retreat, but it also did not advance. In the silence that followed the destruction of the Dreadnought, a shift occurred across the Empire's formation. Subtle at first, then increasingly deliberate. Command protocols that had once been automatic were now paused, reviewed, and reconsidered. Not abandoned, not reversed, but questioned. On the flagship, the commander stood motionless as new data continued to populate the central display. Updated threat assessments, revised risk models, recalculated engagement probabilities. Each one now carried a margin of uncertainty that had not existed before. Fleet-wide status, the commander ordered. Reports came in almost immediately. No additional losses, no further detected strikes, no visible hostile activity from the planet's surface. But that was no longer reassuring, because the absence of visible activity no longer equated to safety. It now suggested restraint, control, intent. Adjust formation spacing, an officer reported. Recommend increased inter-vessel distance. Another added, shield redundancy protocols activated across all capital ships. The fleet was still intact, still operational, still overwhelmingly powerful by conventional standards. And yet, something fundamental had changed. The Empire had arrived expecting compliance, then expected resistance. Now, it faced something else entirely. Uncertainty. On the bridge, the commander turned away from the viewport and addressed the command staff. Reclassify the planet. A pause followed as analysts finalized the updated designation. Designation updated. One of them confirmed. Planetary classification. Elevated threat potential. Another voice followed. Unknown weapons capability confirmed. Engagement parameters incomplete. The commander nodded once. That was enough, because in Imperial doctrine, classification dictated action. And once a world crossed a certain threshold, it was no longer treated as a passive target. It became an active entity within strategic considerations. Meanwhile, below in the descent corridor, dropships continued their approach toward Earth's surface. Their crews remained unaware of the full extent of what had occurred in orbit. Their internal systems still operated under initial assumptions: planetary landing, occupation, control. But those assumptions were beginning to diverge from reality. In the flagship's diplomatic chamber, rarely used in conquest scenarios but maintained for protocol, an envoy was selected, not a military commander, not a war strategist, but a representative trained in communication, negotiation, and interpretation of foreign intent. The decision was not made lightly. It was not standard procedure, but standard procedure had already failed once. Prepare transmission, the commander instructed, not an ultimatum, not a demand, a measured communication. Across encrypted channels, the envoy reviewed updated briefings. Unknown planetary defense capability. Single-shot destruction of capital-class vessel. No identifiable weapon signature. The summary was brief, but its implications were extensive. The envoy paused briefly, processing the information, then spoke quietly to the attending officers. This changes the nature of the encounter. No one disagreed. Back on the bridge, a new transmission was prepared, not repeating the original ultimatum. That message had already been sent, and effectively rendered incomplete. Now, the Empire sought clarity. A controlled beam of communication was directed toward Earth once more, but this time the tone was different, measured, careful, acknowledging. On the surface, planetary communication networks relayed the incoming signal back to the underground facility. In the command chamber, the same display that had shown the Empire's ultimatum, now updated with a new incoming transmission tag. Second contact signal detected. The older scientist from earlier stepped forward slightly, watching the interface. "This is new," he said quietly. Not surprised, not alarmed, simply observant. Operators began decoding the message. The system processed the signal quickly, translating it into a structured format for analysis. In orbit, the envoy's voice, filtered through translation systems, was transmitted toward the planet below. But this time, the words carried a different weight. Not authority, not dominance. Acknowledgement. The message was brief, concise, intentional. On the flagship's bridge, the commander listened as the transmission was relayed back through monitoring systems. And for the first time since arrival, the tone had changed, not just in words, but in intent, because the Empire was no longer issuing commands. It was requesting understanding. In the command chamber beneath Earth's surface, humanity received the transmission in silence. Analysts reviewed it, interpreted it, compared it against the original ultimatum. The contrast was unmistakable. The first message had demanded submission. The second recognized capability. Human leadership exchanged brief glances. No one spoke immediately, because the implications were clear. Humanity had done something unprecedented, without revealing the full extent of its capabilities, without deploying a fleet, without engaging in prolonged conflict. It had forced the most powerful empire in known space to reconsider its approach, not through negotiation, not through alliance, but through a single, undeniable demonstration. On the Railgun's targeting display, orbital tracking continued in real time. The fleet remained above. Dropships still descended. But now, the data included something new: behavioral adjustment, formation changes, communication signals. The Empire was no longer operating under certainty. It was adapting. And adaptation, in this context, meant recognition of humanity not as a passive world, but as a variable that could alter outcomes. Back on the flagship, the envoy stood ready as the response window remained open. The next exchange would determine the direction of this encounter, not the invasion itself, but its nature, because in that moment, suspended between action and reaction, something irreversible had occurred. The Empire had been its posture, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in response to a force it could not ignore. And humanity, quiet, hidden, and unwavering beneath its surface, had become something the galaxy would never again misclassify. Not a primitive world, not an easy conquest, but a presence, and an orbit above Earth. For the first time in recorded imperial history,